Hey everybody, today I'm going to show you how I created this animated motion graphic in After Effects. So let's jump in. So let's first break down what's happening here. We have a bunch of different layers in our timeline here. We have our background layer, which is this video clip of a camera lens rotating. And then we have some text that is animating. It's going from being very big to being smaller in the center of the screen. And then we have some effects on top of this. We have a blur effect, which is causing the text to appear blurred and out of focus at the beginning, and then by the time we get to the end, the text is nice and sharp. We have this effect where there's a diagonal sweeping across our text and making it appear larger. And then we have some atmospherics on top of this. So we have a lens flare, we have some dust, and then we have some film grain. So when we play this through, we can see that we have all these different layers working together to create this atmospheric textured effect. So I'm gonna start by creating a new composition because we're gonna recreate this. So I'm gonna click on this Create a New Composition button in my project window. And I'm going to call this composition comp ident, and I'm going to call this O2 because I've already made one. You can call yours O1 if you would like to. I'm going to set the dimensions of my composition to 1920 by 1080, and then I want to make the duration 4 seconds. Then I'm going to click OK. So we have a blank composition now, our timeline is empty, and we need to start adding some stuff in here. So we're going to start with our text. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to grab my text tool, and I'm going to click anywhere in this window of our composition. I'm just going to type advanced video production. And then I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to go into paragraph. I'm going to make sure that my text is centered. If it's on left justified, let's just change it to centered. And I'm going to go into my align settings, and I'm going to click my align horizontally button, and that's going to center it up from left to right, and then my align vertically button, which is going to center it up from top to bottom. I'm going to go back into my character settings, and I want to change a few things here. First, make sure that your font, if you want yours to match mine exactly, make sure your font is set to Futura PT and the medium weight. If you don't have that font, don't worry, you can use any font that you want to. I have my text size set to 75 pixels, and then I'm going to change my color here. So I'm going to click on this, and again, if you want yours to match mine exactly, you can follow these instructions. I'm going to type in a color hexadecimal code so I can get the perfect blue that I want. It is 89C1CD. So now I have this nice light blue. Again, if you want yours to match mine exactly, type in that number here. You can also pick whatever color that you want. Just make sure that when you're picking a hue over here, you can pick absolutely any hue that you want, so any kind of color. But make sure that you're picking something relatively bright. So you choose your lightness and saturation here. To the right is more saturated, to the left is less saturated. Up is going to be brighter, and down is going to be darker. So we want something that's fairly bright up here. So I'm just going to go back to that original color that I had. So 89C1CD. And I'll click OK. And we're good to go there. So I'm going to go back to my selection tool now. And I want to animate this text so that it starts big and gets to this size by the end of the composition. So I'm going to click on my layer in my timeline. I'm going to hit S on the keyboard. This is going to bring up my scale parameter. And I want to hit this stopwatch here. I'm going to click on that, and that's going to tell After Effects that we want to insert a keyframe here. So the way keyframes work is if I set my scale to 330, which is what we do want it to start at, this is telling After Effects that at this moment in time, where this little blue keyframe is in the timeline, we want our text to be 330% of its original scale. I'm going to go to the 2-second mark, and then I'm going to type in now 100 for my scale, and so now our scale is back to 100% of the normal size. When I move through this, you can see what's happening is between these two keyframes, our text is now animating from that 330% down to 100%. I'm going to make one adjustment to these keyframes, and we're going to do this for every keyframe that we set for this project. I'm going to click and drag a box around both of these, and I'm going to right click on one of them and choose Keyframe Assistant Easy Ease. And what this does is it just smooths out the animation a little bit. So the animation will start a little bit slower, it'll pick up speed, and then it will get a little bit slower right before the end of the animation. So it just kind of makes it look smoother when we play it through. The next thing I'm going to do is put a little blur effect on this text. I always think that overly sharp text looks a little bit strange, especially when you're pairing it with some live action footage, because nothing is this perfectly sharp in the real world. So to make this look a little bit more natural, I'm going to go up into my effects and presets up here, and I'm just going to type in this search bar blur. And then I'm going to scroll down and find this Gaussian blur. I'm going to click and drag this onto my advanced video production text layer. And then up here now we have some parameters that we can adjust. So the only thing I want to do here is take this blurriness and set it from 0, and we're going to change that to 2. And so it just blurs it a little bit. It's probably pretty hard to see, especially on your screen, but I think it just makes everything look a little bit more natural. Now at this point, we're going to start adding a lot of different layers. We're going to add a lot of different effects, and this is really going to slow down our computer. So I'm going to set my resolution by clicking on this drop-down menu. I'm going to set it from full down to quarter. And this is going to make this all look a little bit pixelated and not very nice, but it's also going to make After Effects have a much easier time of playing it through and scrubbing through our composition. When we export these, we're going to set them back to full resolution, and they're going to look great, but just for ease of editing, let's keep it at 1/4. All right, now let's add that blur effect, because remember in our original composition, the text starts out blurry and then it kind of comes into focus over the course of the composition. So we're going to do that by adding what's called an adjustment layer. I'm going to right click in this timeline area and say New Adjustment Layer. And I want to stay organized, and I recommend that you do this for all of your projects. I'm going to make sure that this adjustment layer is selected, and I'm going to hit Enter on my keyboard, and that's going to allow me to change the name of it. I'm just going to call this Camera Blur, because we're going to use an effect called Camera Lens Blur on this. So we already have blur searched for in our effects and presets, so we can just come up here and find our camera lens blur. I'm going to click and drag that onto my camera blur layer. And then this has a preset of 5 for the blur radius. We're going to change this to 94. So click on it and type in 94, and it's going to get really blurry. So when we play this through, we have this nice blur, but the problem is it's not getting sharp by the end. So we need to set some keyframes to tell this layer that we want it to go from 94 blur to 0 blur. So I'm going to click on the stopwatch next to blur radius, and this is going to set a keyframe at the beginning of the composition, and it's going to say the blur radius at this point is 94. I'm going to move my playhead to the 2-second mark, and then I'm going to click on this and change it to 0. So we can't see our keyframes down here, which is kind of a problem. So let's click on our layer, and with the layer selected in the timeline, we can hit U as in uniform, and that's going to bring up our keyframes. So if I click and drag a box around these, I'm going to right click on them and do the same thing we did with our text layer. I'm going to go to Keyframe Assistant and choose Easy Ease. So now when we play this through, we have our text getting smaller, and we also have it coming into focus. Now let's tackle that effect where we have this diagonal sweep across that is making the text larger and making it not blurry anymore as it goes across. And the way that we're going to do that is with another adjustment layer. So I'm going to right click, I'm going to say New and Adjustment Layer. With it selected, I'm going to press Enter again. I'm going to change the name to Scale. And we're going to go into our effects and presets. We're going to search for Transform. and we'll click and drag this transform effect onto our scale layer. And the only thing that we need to do in here is under the scale parameter, we're going to change this to 200. So it just scaled up our entire composition, so everything is larger now. But remember, we want it to just sweep across diagonally. So we're going to create that effect by drawing a layer mask on this layer. So we're going to mask out this effect and have it only appear in certain areas of this scale layer. So to start, I'm going to go over to my magnification amount over here, and I'm going to change this to 50 just to give myself a little bit more room to work with here. And then this is really important. Make sure the scale layer is selected. I'm going to go up to the rectangle tool, and then I just want to draw a rectangle kind of like this so that part of it is going off screen to the left, part of it is going off screen to the right. And so this is a mask. What this is doing is if I select this mask and move it around, you can see what's happening here. Anything inside of the mask is getting scaled up because we have this transform effect on it, and anything that's outside of the mask is not getting scaled up. So I'm going to drag this back to where I want it. And we need to make this into a diagonal rhombus instead of this rectangle here. So make sure your selection tool is highlighted in blue up here. And then click anywhere outside of your mask to deselect all of the edge points. And then we're going to click on this top right point and then hold down Shift and click on this bottom right point. And then we're just going to drag these up. Maybe to something like that. I'm going to do the same thing over here on the left. Click on the top left point, hold down Shift, click on the bottom left point, and drag both of them down. So now we have this diagonal shape. And we're going to animate this diagonal mask so that it is sweeping across our image. So to do that, we need to come into our mask settings and let's click on the scale layer and hit M on the keyboard. M as in Mike. And then we have this mask path parameter, and we can click the stopwatch. We'll make sure that our playhead is at the beginning of the sequence. We'll hit the stopwatch to create a keyframe, and then we need to move our mask up. So you can see how my mouse cursor is white here, and then when I hover over the very edge of our mask, it turns black. So that's what we want. When it turns black, we can double click to select the entire mask, and then I'm just going to drag it up. So this is where this mask is going to start. And then I'm going to move to the 2-second mark in my timeline. And I'm going to double click on the mask again. And I'm going to drag it down just out of frame to the bottom. And this is where the mask is going to end up. We're going to click and drag a box around both of our keyframes. Right click on one of them, Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. And now when we play this through, that mask should be sweeping across our text. And you can see that it is. And that's because the mask at this point is, remember, up here, and then at the end, it's all the way down here. So in the meantime, it's just going across. Now, I'm not crazy about these hard edges on this mask. I want them to blend in a little bit more. This is a really easy fix. So I'm going to click on Scale, and I'm going to press MF for our mask feather parameter. And then I'm going to go over here, I'm going to click on this 0.0, I'm going to change it to 50. So now this just softens out the edge a little bit. And if I click away, you can see that this is a little bit softer than it was before when it was at, here's 0. And then here is that 50 in the mask feather. Okay, so there's something else that we need to change here. So this is highlighting our text, it's making it larger, but it's still like really blurry in here. And remember, in our original composition, the text gets sharp as it gets larger, as that diagonal sweeps across. So to do this, we're just gonna select our mask from our scale layer. So if you don't see this mask here, we can click on Scale, hit M on the keyboard, and that's gonna bring up our mask. I'm gonna press Control-C if you're on a PC, that's Command-C if you're on a Mac. That's gonna copy our mask. going to move my playhead back to the front of the composition, the beginning of the composition, and then I'm going to go to my camera blur layer, and I'm going to press Control V, or if you're on a Mac, Command V, and that's going to paste this same mask. I'm going to hit M on my keyboard with camera blur selected, so we just see our mask here. So this same mask is now on our camera blur layer. The problem is what's happening here is it's masking in this blurriness. And we want it to do the opposite. We want it to mask out the blurriness. So you can see that we have next to mask 1, we have the setting add. We actually want this to subtract. So if I click on this drop down and then choose subtract, it's going to reverse our effect here, reverse our mask, so everything inside of the mask is not getting this blur and everything outside of the mask is still getting the blur. So now if I play this through, this is looking much more like what we're going for. At this point, we can go ahead and bring in our background layer. Remember, we had that camera lens rotating clip. So I'm going to go into my project window and I'm going to find that Canon lens rotating video clip, and I'm going to drag this underneath of all of my layers, and it puts it right into our composition now. So in our original composition, remember that background layer is really subtle. It's very blue. It looks absolutely nothing like this. So to achieve that look, we're going to go into our effects and presets, and we're going to type in tint, and then we'll drag this tint effect onto the camera lens layer. So what tint does is it takes everything in the image that is black or dark and it changes it to whatever color you tell it to. Right now it's just set to black. And it does the same thing with white, and right now that's just set to white. So this is effectively just converted this to a black and white layer. But we're going to change these values by clicking on these different swatches here. So I'm going to click on my black swatch. And then again, if you want yours to match mine exactly, you can type in a hexadecimal code here. The value that we're going to put in here is 131316, and this is just a really dark desaturated blue. It's almost gray. I'm going to click OK to that. And then with the white, we're going to put in 202027, and this is just a slightly more saturated, slightly brighter blue, and I'll click OK. Now there's one thing I'm already noticing that's going wrong here. We have these weird dark edges, and that is a result of our camera blur layer. All we need to do is go into our camera blur layer and then click on this repeat edge pixels button, and that's going to get rid of those. So now we have our background layer. This is really starting to come together. The only thing we need to do now is add some atmosphere. So the first bit of atmosphere I'm going to add is a lens flare. So I'm going to again go into my project window, and I'm going to find this blue flares background, and I'm going to drag it on top of all of my layers. So we need to make sure that everything underneath of here is showing through. And we're going to make a couple of adjustments to make that happen. So first, let's go ahead and throw another tint onto this because I want to adjust the color slightly. So I'm going to drag that onto this layer. It's going to turn it to black and white, but we're going to make some changes here. I'm not going to change the black setting, but I am going to change the white setting. And I'm going to put in a warm color here because I want it to contrast with all that blue, all that cool blue. Will look really nice with kind of a golden yellow. So I'm going to type in FFE1A5, and that's going to give us this really bright, pretty desaturated gold, and then I'll click OK. So next we need to set our blend mode so that everything underneath of here shows through. So under this mode setting, we have a drop down, and we're going to change it from normal to soft light. So now we see some of our lens flare effect, but we also still see everything else underneath of it. And I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit bigger on my screen now. So I'm just going to go to where we had set it to 50% magnification. I'm going to set it to fit up to 100%. Now, I think that this effect is a little too pronounced, and I want to dull it down a little bit. So I'm going to do that by changing the opacity of this layer, and I can do that by clicking on it and then press T on the keyboard, and that's going to bring up my opacity parameter, and I'm going to change this from 100% to 50%. And I also want this big part of the flare, I want it to be on the bottom here instead of on the top. And so I'm going to do this by changing the scale of my clip. So I'm going to select my layer again. I'm going to press S on the keyboard to bring up my scale parameter. And before we adjust these values, I need to unclick this link here. So when this is clicked, if I change my scale, it's going to scale up both my width and my height to the same value. I'll set this back to 100. But I want to just change my height here. So I'm going to click on this, and then I can change one of these and it won't change the other. So I'm going to change this height value to -100, and that's just going to flip this upside down. So now the big part of our flare is down here in the bottom left and not in the top left. Okay, there's just a couple more things we need to do now to add a little bit more texture, a little bit more atmosphere. So I'm going to go back into my project window. I'm going to grab this dust clip, drag it to the top of my timeline. And again, we need to make sure that this is blending in and not covering up everything. So I'm going to go into my blend mode and I'm going to change this to add. I also want to change the scale of this clip. This clip is twice the size of our composition, and I want to scale it down a little bit. So I'm going to hit S on my keyboard to bring up my scale parameter, and I'm going to change this to 50%. And then I also want to change the opacity. I think this is too bright. I like all these little pieces of dust floating around. Again, they just give it some more texture and atmosphere, but it's just too bright. It's too pronounced. So I'm gonna, with my dust layer selected, I'm gonna press T on the keyboard, and I'm gonna change the opacity to 20%. So now it's a really subtle effect. It's showing up, but it's not distracting from everything else. Now there's just one more layer that I want to add to this, and I'm going to close up all of my layers here so I have a little bit more room to work with. And I'm going to right click, say new, and adjustment layer. And I'm going to rename this grain because we're going to add a little bit of film grain to this. So in my effects and presets, I'm going to search for grain. I'm going to find my add grain preset, drag this onto our grain layer. And grain is, let me actually change this to full resolution so you can see. The way this effect works is we have this box when we're set on this preview viewing mode, and anything inside of here is showing you what the grain is going to look like on your clip. I'm going to go ahead and set this to final output so you can see better what this grain is doing. When you have it set to the preview, it makes it a lot easier on your computer to render everything out and view it more quickly, but I want to show you what's happening on our frame. So all of this like pixelated, kind of noisy stuff here, this is grain. And it just gives it kind of an organic sort of filmic look that I think looks really nice and is a nice last layer to add. So I want to change a few settings in here. I'm going to choose a specific film grain that I really like. So I'm going to click from this preset drop-down menu, the Kodak Vision 200T film grain. I just really like the look of this one. And then I'm going to change the intensity to 0.6 because I don't want quite so much grain in here. You can see how long it's taking my computer to render all of this out. This is why it's really helpful to work in a lower resolution, but I wanted you to be able to see the grain here on my screen. But I'm going to go ahead and switch this back to a lower resolution just to make these last few steps a little bit easier. I also want to go into my color setting, and I want this to be monochromatic. I don't want there to be any color in this grain. I want it to just be black and white, so I'm going to click this monochromatic button here. So that is everything that we need to do for this composition. So if we want to watch it back, we can do that. We'll keep it in quarter resolution for that, just so we can see if it's doing the general thing that we want it to, keeping in mind that it's going to be a little bit pixelated. It's not going to look quite as good as it does when we actually render this thing out. And you'll notice what's happening here is the timeline is turning green. Anything that's green has been rendered and can be played at full speed. Anything that's not green cannot be played at full speed through. So now this is cycling through. We can see the motion looks good. This looks almost exactly like the one that I showed you at the beginning. And now all we need to do is render it out. So I'm going to change my resolution back to full. And then to export this, I'm going to go to File, Export, Add to Media Encoder Queue. Okay, so Adobe Media Encoder has opened up and we have our composition in our queue. So this is just a list of things that will be rendered when we press this play button. So what we're doing here is we're converting this from an After Effects format that has all of those layers into a finished video file that can be played back easily on the web, can be played on your computer. So we need to make sure that our settings are right before we export this. So I'm going to click on this H.264 thing here. You might see something different. That's okay. Just click on this far left blue text and make sure that your format is set to H.264. And then under preset, we're going to choose YouTube 1080p Full HD. For the output name, we're just going to leave this as comp ident 02 or 01, whatever you named it. That's fine. But I do want to click on this and I want to make sure that I save it in a place where I'm going to be able to find it. So I'm going to go to my desktop. I'm going to choose my advanced video folder and I'm going to click save. So all of the other settings can stay the same. So we'll just click OK and then we will press this play button and let our encoder do its thing. So I'm going to speed this up and then I'll show you the finished composition. Okay, so Media Encoder has finished rendering this out, and there's this really helpful blue link here. If I click on this, it's going to show me exactly where my file ended up, and then I can play this through. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions.